Let's see if this works.
I can hear you.
So I guess there's the usual spiel about this is a CNCF community meeting / under the Kubernetes community code of conduct. So basically, don't be a jerk to anyone. This meeting possibly will be recorded and uploaded publicly to YouTube. Hi, so I don't think we actually had any particular agenda items today. We've actually been missing this one for a little bit. The attendance dropped, and we've mostly handled discussing things through the issue tracker and a little bit in Slack, but not so much, mostly captured in the issue tracker, I'd say.
Is there any agenda document? I'm just used to the agenda document from the testing group.
There is. I'm not sure why it's not linked. It's on the. It should be on the invite and in the community info for the meeting.
I don't even have an invite. I think I just added myself a calendar notification to this.
Okay, it should be on the SIG testing calendar.
Okay. I'll find it somewhere.
I just sent the link to this meeting.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess we have had conversations before in the testing group, maybe through issues. But I'm from the Kima project, in case you heard of that. We're heavily using Prow, and we're looking into using Kind for testing as well. So I'm just trying to stay on top of what's coming, what's going. Can we help with features that we need or something? And I just try to stay on top of that.
At the moment, we've got a few features up in the air besides just some like maintenance work, keeping up with Kubernetes and dependencies and whatnot. So let's see, big ones. We're almost done landing decoupling most of the code base from Docker, or at least the parts that involve cluster manipulation. The image build is not at all, but we're going to handle that separately. And the goal there is to make it a little bit more testable internally and to start finally rolling out some limited support for things like Podman as alternative ways of creating and managing nodes. So we'll continue to use the same Docker image. Contains a Kubernetes snapshot, but we may support other backends for running the image. It's not super high priority. The decoupling and being able to test was more important, but that may be useful in the future. What else?
I have a question regarding Kind use cases in general. Like, do you see it as something that I can use locally as well? Because
so it's really important that you can run it locally as well. One of the main benefits versus some of the alternative ways that we test Kubernetes is that you can replicate this on your machine without any cloud resources. That said, I frequently get people asking, does this replace Minikube? And not necessarily. Using VMs has better isolation. You're not sharing a kernel. So you can do interesting things like loading drivers. You can enforce that swap is off and ensure that memory limits work, though I've heard that Minikube may actually have swap enabled. I'm not sure why. But like that sort of thing, you can run into problems where some of the more advanced features really depend on good host level support, and you're not getting a real host in the container. So it's pretty good for like, I need a Kubernetes API, I want to test some things. This is a temporary throwaway cluster.
Yeah.
It's a bit weak at the moment at long-lived clusters. There's some awkward pain points there to fix. One second.
Yeah, I noticed when I used it locally and basically left for lunch and came back, like my computer was kind of unusable after that. I don't know what that was.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know on that one. I don't personally test this too much because again, that wasn't really the original intended use case, and we've still got problems we need to tackle on the main use case. But long term, we do want to try to improve that sort of thing. That said, I don't think Kind is doing anything special there.
I assume
It's
I
more
mean,
of
I have the same problem with Minikube. I just would assume it's something with hibernation of a Mac or a computer in general that has problems with restoring the state of when you come back out of hibernation of the computer.
Yeah, I suspect as well. I would guess there are things that are trying to watch at for and keep updated. And I would bet that most of that is somewhat time based and that um, sorry, one sec. And so that may not really, I don't think there's anything that we're doing in Kind that will really fix that. That said, we have done some work upstream to fix various things. It may be possible, but I'm guessing that's fairly deeply rooted.
Yeah, I don't see that personally as a problem. Like I just have to remind myself, like if I want to do something, I do it before lunch, and then after lunch I start over again if I need to.
The only thing
But
I'm trying to do is continue to make it cheaper to start over. I think it's better from a testing perspective that most of your testing be done on a clean slate. Um, I'm aware that there are a few, particularly when you're not testing Kubernetes, like getting the getting the images into your cluster, where it would be nice if it were cheaper to do. And we're exploring some options for that.
yeah, I saw someone ask that question on the Kind chat, I think Friday or something, with is there an easier way to get images into the cluster? Oh, actually it was today.
Um,
Where you answer basically, oh, Kind load is what we're using.
Yeah, it's what we're using for now because it's pretty reliable and it doesn't depend on the network. And if you need to do things like authenticated access, you don't have to worry about getting that into the cluster. You just pull it to your host, which is like you already understand as a user. Like I need to authenticate my Docker. There's good UX for that. Whereas it tends to be, especially for new users, it tends to be trickier to get them to understand things like you know, using image pull secrets or something like that.
Are you aware of the, I mean, I assume you're also in the SIG testing. We're heavily looking into getting metrics out of all our test pipelines that we have. And I mean, we're using Minikube, we're trying to use Kind as well. Like, is there anything in particular that you already solved in terms of a running cluster on Kind and all the metrics of failing components that you have in there, being pieces of microservices that we deploy ourselves, writing to a Prometheus running next to Kind or in Kind, and then exporting that? Or
No, I mean, so I've been working more on collecting, like profiling Kind itself, but as far as like Kubernetes and things, the standard tends to actually be the logs for the components. So we have a little bit of tooling for collecting those, but most of the Kubernetes components themselves are not instrumented in this way. And definitely that's been the primary focus. Going forward, we have some, we have some other users, for example, from where I work, Istio is a big user that I try to, give some of my time to keeping up with what they're using. They're, I believe, using it for all their pre-submits. And so, they're testing an application on top of Kubernetes instead of Kubernetes itself. But I think this sort of like instrumentation thing is usually done um, at their at their level and is not usually specific to kind.
Yeah, we're using Istio with Kima as well, so that's pretty easy for us to look at what they're doing and maybe just copy over some special tricks that they found out.
Yeah, I don't think they're doing anything super special in that area. Yeah. Um, uh, Other things, let's see. We're working a little bit on the UX. The export cube config thing has been a real tripping point. It is different from other clusters. So I think we're headed towards writing to the default one by default, unless you specify the cube config path you want, and handling config merging and that sort of thing. It will take a bit of work because Kubeatom doesn't actually handle this very well, but we can rewrite it. We can take the output from Kubeatom and rewrite it into a format that will work, and it's actually not terribly involved. It's mostly been some decision making around that. And I think that's what you'll find with most of kind in general, is that the easy problems are solved and the really hard problems are usually really hard things that are not actually like an issue with kind, they're upstream. Like one we're dealing with now that we haven't decided how to, we're still investigating, is that it appears that Docker exec as a mechanism is slightly flaky, especially on busy hosts. It's somewhat unlikely that we're going to go fix that upstream, but we might engineer some alternative to it, but it's not going to be like a quick change. It's going to involve some fairly large changes to, because that is the mechanism by which we do most getting things in and out of the cluster and starting processes and whatnot, and it doesn't have a trivial alternative. Similarly, we've got some things like people would like it to work on Chrome OS, and it's like, well, it's like there's some security restrictions that kind of block that, or like that sort of thing. A few other ones, like it would be great if we had automated releases of Kubernetes node images, but there's two problems there. One is just infrastructure. Tossing this on Prow isn't secure enough. We need to think about this a little bit more carefully, since people are going to run these as somewhat effectively controlling their host. And just that, like, we need to think more about how we communicate with users, that like there's no guarantee that this node image works with this other version. So far we've solved that by, we only list them out in the release notes, and we're very clear about it there. But if we start publishing them all the time automatically, and the mechanism by which you find them is just looking at the Docker registry, it's going to be a little bit harder to get that across. We just haven't decided yet. Probably the most interesting one that can get solved that isn't solved yet is going to be dynamic volume provisioning. That one, there are a number of options to work in the ecosystem and improve the options for local storage. That's another one where like Minikube has some tricks that they use that are pretty straightforward, but they are straightforward because they only work for one node, which is somewhat limiting for kind, and not an option that we'd really want to ship. We'll want to get it working for multi-node. It's pretty important to Kubernetes testing, and I think it's somewhat important to robust application testing. I think there are classes of wanting to handle things like rolling over deployments and things where you want to know that it behaves, and it's a little bit more straightforward to do that if you tell Kubernetes that you've got it running across n nodes and you want to cycle it, things like stateful sets. So that's probably the most interesting open one to look into right now. But it's going to involve some like ecosystem work. Like the solution in kind is pretty much just going to be start deploying one of these, instead of using one of the built-in provisioners. But the only reason we're not doing that yet is that the things to start deploying need work.
Okay. Are you aware if anyone or you guys even tried deploying kind on all the hyperscalers, like Azure, AWS, Ali Cloud?
Well, I mean, so kind itself isn't aware of being deployed to a cloud. It just wants Docker.
Okay, so no major issues as long as Docker is there, basically, or
Right.
nothing that you're aware of at the moment.
You can cause problems for yourself by doing things like running that Docker nested, or in some other weird configuration. Like I know, for example, that there's some legacy tooling called Docker Machine that people use on Mac that like did its own management of booting a VM and whatnot. And we haven't had the capacity to test that, and it has some strange quirks, and it doesn't work. The other one that we've seen tends to be the file system for Docker storage. A lot of people that are major Linux power users will do something like run their system with ZFS and tweak Docker to run with the ZFS, and that works okay for Docker, but it doesn't, even without kind, it doesn't really work for Kubernetes. And adding like nested container runtimes, it definitely doesn't work. So we tend to see that with all of the like non-default file system drivers. Most of them don't work for this.
Okay.
Probably the biggest tripping point, and it's again like there's not really anything we can do in kind about that. It's just down to how the file system works and the fact that we're trying to sort of put containers in containers.
Okay. I mean, it's a good start for me to look into this more. Like I'm trying to play around with it, try to run our stuff on it locally and in our GCP accounts. And we're thinking about even adding this additionally to Minikube and eventually moving away from Minikube and just running tests on kind. But we're not there yet. And
it's certainly intended for usage, but I will say there are definitely classes of testing where, I would tell people, use Minikube or look in your options, maybe a MicroK8s or something. The thing I like about kind is that it works so many places easily. Like when it does break down, it tends to be painful, but that is usually some kind of esoteric host. Like I said, like Docker running on ZFS, which is generally problematic.
yeah.
Without kind or Betterfs. But there are cases where you need that VM level isolation, which we can't offer at the moment. We might in the future with one of the container runtime options that is actually backed by KVM or similar, but it'll probably be less portable and maybe not quite as well supported, at least initially. And the things like GPUs, a lot of applications don't need this, but if you do need this, it is possible to sort of do a local one. That said, I would also recommend for some of these to use real clusters or to like spin up a simple one node Kubernetes. It's not that hard generally, and it has some upsides. I think my current recommendation is to use unit and integration tests as much as you can, and then when you need to do things like CRDs that need a Kubernetes API server to really effectively be tested, then use kind for your pre-submits and use something closer to your prod environment for like post-submit or periodic QA testing or even manual testing before release, something along those lines to just make sure that, maybe even like performance testing or something, make sure that things behave in the environments you actually expect to be deployed to, because there are going to be some level of difference. I mean, even just Kubernetes itself has so many knobs configuration-wise that I think it's wise to separate out testing. Okay, we've tested that our controller behaves and can do interactions between controllers and custom resource instances and whatnot. But then there's also the does it behave fully as expected in the prod environment? You probably don't want to be spinning that up on every PR, but you should test it at some point. I think
Yeah, we're doing that anyways. So we have Minikube aside of all the integration test deployments that we do on real Kubernetes environments.
right. So given that, I think it leaves room for like kind of use like the whole spectrum of there's a lot of options for deploying Kubernetes and just sort of finding, um, what works for what you're trying to test and where you're trying to test it and how quickly and whatnot. And I think Kind is a pretty good option for quick local testing that you can run pretty much wherever you can run Docker, but it's certainly not perfect, and some of the flaws are not they're not trivially solvable. Like you can't necessarily guarantee that memory limits will work. It depends on the host, and some classes of testing really want to check that sort of thing. What happens when it moves or something, and it is possible to write testing like that. But there's only so much Kind can do to make sure that that will actually happen. If your host has swap enabled, uh, that there's not really anything we can do.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I don't want to keep you any longer from doing other work. Thank you for all the insights already. And I guess I hope that there's more on the agenda next meeting in 2 weeks.
Yeah, we'll see. Like I said, I think a lot of the discussions have moved to like if we want to discuss some particular feature, we're not waiting every 2 weeks, and we haven't had big high level stuff for a while because we're kind of behind tackling all the things that we already planned out. Like for example, we had a release scheduled maybe 2 weeks ago, but we held it on like let's continuing ironing out some changes before we cut another release.
Was that the 0.6 release?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're most of the way to the Docker decoupling, but it's not really there. That leaves a few things a little awkward. We also did some pretty major rework of logging, but it's not fully complete. So I think the biggest one is I probably want to land the kubeconfig management changes and take a stab at that this week and see how involved that is. Because it's not too involved, I just assume land all of the command line interface changes in a release and say, okay, we're moving closer to beta. We went ahead and changed the logging and the kubeconfig stuff to make it better going forward, but you should migrate instead of having two more releases where both of them require some kind of migration like that.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. All right. I got to jump and leave you to it.
I will see you around.
All right. Have a good one. Thank you.